Uh, Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Dimitri Gusev. I'm an associate professor of computer and information technology at Purdue University in the state of Indiana. And it's great to be here today in San Francisco at Data for Democracy, a conference within Data by the Bay. And let's begin this talk about how we can quantify democracy and freedom by taking into account human rights, including the right for education, especially secondary education, and perhaps counterintuitively compare that to some important fertility metrics. So we'll begin with a thought-provoking quote. I guess it's cool to be extinct, though, from a prominent comics artist, accompanied by some other artists, a cartoon where the dinosaurs are saying to Noah, "No thanks, we got a good deal on the Carnival cruise." We will briefly introduce a quote, a famous quote from the United States Declaration of Independence that mentions the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And it's combined here with a graph showing the pretty rapid growth of the world population and the question, can we even afford 2 out of 3 in this triad, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Can we be happy and die happy? That doesn't sound all that optimistic, right? Like those dinosaurs on the Carnival cruise. So let's look and find out what the inspiration for this study was. Let me quote George Bernard Shaw. I will talk about some solutions here, and we cannot be certain about how good those solutions truly are, because there is a large degree of uncertainty in what we're dealing with. Fortunately or unfortunately, maybe that's where the fun is, but George Bernard Shaw once said, for every complex solution, there is a, for every complex problem, there is a simple solution. That is wrong. And the inspiration for this study is this book, The End of Poverty by Jeffrey Sachs, a Nobel Prize winning economist, published back in 2005. You may have noticed that poverty has not been eradicated yet since 2005. That is not to say necessarily why those solutions that were proposed here were unequivocally wrong. It's just, it's difficult even to have the countries that would have to contribute to the proposed solutions to do it. So the graph from Jeffrey Sachs's work is here, and it shows the dependency of the GDP per capita to the total fertility rate in children per woman. And considering that this is per capita, you realize that if some of these folks contributing to the per capita side in the denominator are little children, then, or even older children, even if they work hard in a sweatshop, that doesn't contribute a whole lot to the GDP, considering that they're working for peanuts if they're working. So no surprise that there are countries for which we have high fertility and very low GDP per capita. And unsurprisingly, it is related to the amounts of education that people get in these respective countries. So Jeffrey Sachs himself illuminates numerous factors, especially why girls' education has impact on the situation with fertility, because first of all, it allows women, once they get the education, to more easily join the labor force in their respective countries, or maybe go somewhere else where the jobs are, but you know, they join the labor force, and that increases the cost of staying home to bear children. So they would then give a second thought to the notion that they would, once they started to work, stop working and instead decide to rear children, right? Another factor is that once they get education, then in the countries that provide such opportunities to women to get good education, there are also laws and social action factors that would empower those women to, let's phrase it the way he did, to more easily make fertility choices. Then another factor in those countries is that in those countries, the chances of the children that are born to actually survive are better because they don't have such high mortality. So the parents then may have to be able to, they may have an opportunity to decide that they can have fewer children because they have a good hope that those children will survive. So that lowers the so-called replacement rate, which is a very important parameter for this study. This is the rate in children per woman that a given country has to sustain in order not to have its population decrease, assuming that it's not some overpopulated country that would actually like that population to decrease. There are other problems with having it decrease, is like the population would get older and who would support the older folks. Let's, for the moment, say that globally, it's estimated, the replacement rate, it's not easy to estimate, at 2.3, and in developed countries like the United Kingdom, for example, it's down to 2.1. The latest estimate I saw for the United Kingdom is 2.075. For biological reasons, pretty much we can conclude that the replacement rate cannot possibly be lower than 2, because if in a hypothetical situation, a woman would bear 2 children and one of them is a girl, another one is a boy, and let's say they're from the same biological father, then the girl replaces the mother, the boy replaces the biological father. It gets a bit more complicated if there are 2 biological fathers involved, because then there are 3 people to replace, assuming that the third parent would not have other children. But in the ideal situation, it doesn't seem like we can go lower than 2. Another contributing factor that Jeffrey Sachs does not mention, but which is easy to deduce from other data that I'm quoting here, is that the teen pregnancy is lower for girls that stay in school. And we can argue that it works both ways, because in 20% cases, according to that paper, of the high school dropouts, pregnancy and motherhood play a role in the girl's decision not to stay in high school and drop out. But in a poor country where there is no school for that girl to drop out of to begin with, in a poor community, it only works one way, toward getting married and having children right away or soon afterwards. There are alternatives to the education factor in how the governments in other countries might choose to control fertility. They would include administrative ban on having more than a certain number of children, like 1 child until recently. Nowadays, they're allowing couples to have up to 2 children in China. This is a recent development there. Or perhaps promotion of or enforcement of sterilization of girls, which happened not just in India at some point of time, but earlier there was a case precedent in the US Supreme Court, the case of Carrie Buck versus Bell, where the United States Supreme Court back then, headed by Oliver Wendell, allowed forced sterilization of a girl who was considered, the court decided she was too feeble-minded to have children, and her child that was born prior to that actually showed good results in school before she unfortunately died young. So this was a case that was quite unfortunate, but it's a precedent that actually, although to some extent it's no longer valid, there are things there that still stand. So I have decided to test the statements by Jeffrey Sachs on the impact of education. Of course, the interesting education here to consider is upper secondary education. To explain that quickly, okay, primary education is primary education. Lower secondary education is middle school. Upper secondary education here is high school. The so-called tertiary education, in terms of this international terminology, is what we call higher education, college and such. Plotted data for 147 countries. Some of them are small countries, like San Marino, and may not be very interesting to us. Others are large and important countries and developed countries, and we will look into that. And I plotted that data on fertility against, I plotted the data for fertility from World Bank against the upper secondary education completion data from two main sources, UNESCO Institute for Statistics, UIS, and the report by Barrow and Lee, published a bit earlier in 2010, for 86 countries. So we're taking the countries for which we have both kinds of data, both fertility data and secondary education, upper secondary education completion data for girls, with one exception for Vietnam, for which I took the data from a report that is on completion of upper secondary education by both girls and boys, but with a note in that report and the data on their enrollment that shows that the similar percentages of girls and boys are enrolled in high school education in Vietnam, and therefore we can take the joint rate of completion. And the plot, as shown here, we can see the United States near the top here. In terms of education, education is this axis, the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is fertility in terms of children per woman. We see very high fertility over here in this corner, combined with very low level of high school completion for girls. And as a matter of fact, for all countries here, with the exception of Dominica, which is an island and a small island, and they don't probably intend to have high fertility, wherever we have low completion of high school education for girls, we tend to also have a pretty high fertility. The important threshold of fertility being about 2.1, 2.3, depending on the country. So you can see the United States offers 90% of the girls high school education, but at the same time we see now the most up-to-date fertility rate below the replacement rate. And there is a big cluster of such countries, including Japan, Korea, Germany, Denmark, that are in this situation. There are a few exceptions, like the glorious nation of Kazakhstan, that gives a lot of diplomas to girls, and yet they have high fertility. One of the possible explanations is, can we trust their stats? Another better explanation is, perhaps in that country, even if you get a high school diploma, you still cannot find a job, and then that explains why they maintain relatively high fertility. So we don't want to take them as an example, especially considering that Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are not considered particularly democratic or free countries. So taking them as an example doesn't sound like a good idea. We see China in this corner, importantly, because they control their fertility administratively. So even though they don't have a good record on upper secondary education for girls, they still manage to have low fertility. But that's, again, not the method that we would like to adopt. So let's take a look. We are prepared to take a look at Israel, which is prominently featured here with fertility above 3 and a good record on upper secondary education for women. The overall trends, I mean, this was a static slice. We want to know the trends over time. How are things doing? Overall, you can see that Africa is trending down. This is the data from the United Nations. We can see the whole world trending down. We can see developed nations supposedly trending up a little bit, but this was a graph made back in 2008, so we're talking about projections and extrapolation, and I would like to immediately attract your attention to the dangers of extrapolation, in that if you cut off at 2008, you will see that you're not really guaranteed the soft landing. Maybe you're slowly but surely nosediving, nobody knows, all right? But these are the trends overall. We'll find out that Israel disagrees with that trend locally. And since we mentioned before some countries like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, whatnot, then we would like to also look at the metrics of democracy and freedom before we jump to any conclusions. For that, I found data in 2 major ratings. One is the Democracy Index, published annually by the Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU, for 167 countries. Another one rates not democracy but freedom, which is a bit different thing. Freedom in the World by Freedom House. They've rated 211 countries, so that includes some small countries, like I mentioned, I don't know, San Marino, and there are other countries like Liechtenstein and whatnot, Luxembourg, etc. So they rated countries, Andorra, you'll see. Let's make the observation that, before we see the graph, that even though education is indeed essential to democracy, because we don't want, patently incompetent, poorly educated people to make important choices, we hope that people have the right amount of information that would enable them to make conscious choices when it comes to making their decisions as part of the democracy, right? But not the other way around. Countries are known to have provided their citizens good education, but no major freedoms, human rights, democracy, and such. So then the next question is, well, we have 2 ratings. Do they even correlate? Does this democracy from one think tank correlates with freedom according to another think tank? So this is the new thing that I've done. Not the most important thing, but it shows you something about how you would work with data. And prior to that, I did compare how well the data correlated on secondary education completion from those 2 sources that I mentioned, and that correlated very well. And this correlates very well as well. They may have some disagreements on Guinea-Bissau right here, but overall they correlate very well. And in particular, the data on Israel puts Israel somewhere here with one rating being 7.7 on the democracy scale, another one being 80 points on the freedom scale. So they're somewhere there, not too far away from countries like Italy, France, etc. All right, so we have a good correspondence between the democracy and freedom indices developed by 2 different organizations, but with people in those organizations that have reasonably good common notion of what these things constitute, and we will perhaps look now in more details on their criteria that will further illuminate the fact why this correlates. That correlates not just because they have this general idea of freedom and democracy and it matches. They are looking at some of the common things. The democracy index is 4/5 based on the government, the the electoral process, the functioning of the government, the political participation, and political culture. And then 1/5 or 20% of the democracy index is compiled based on civil liberties, and that is 60% of the freedom in the world scores. And 40% of the freedom in the world scores are based on the political rights, which again say electoral process, again they say political pluralism, just like pluralism is there, and participation, and you see participation here, functioning of government, same thing as here. So no wonder it correlates, and when it comes to civil liberties categories, you will see, as promised, human rights, collective and individual. You will see freedom of expression, associational rights, such as, these are collective rights, rule of law, and personal autonomy and individual human rights. So yes, no wonder these two metrics correlate. Let's now plot fertility against democracy. That's where we see a big clump. The border of 8 for the democracy index is the border above which they consider a country a full democracy. Below that, they consider it flawed democracy, so they find some flaws, rating at 7.7 in the Israeli democracy, but still not a bad rating here. UK is over here, United States is over here. So there is a cluster of countries that are considered full democracies by EUI, and they're all noticeably below the replacement rate. And there's a bunch of countries right here that are considered flawed democracies, and they're still below the replacement fertility rate. The other country here next to Israel is Botswana. Botswana, I would consider an outlier. The GDP of Botswana is about $7,000 per capita compared to $33,000 per capita for Israel. About a quarter of population of Botswana is HIV infected. So taking Botswana as an example doesn't seem like a good thing. We will look at Israel in more details because also we could have looked at the trends. Are they trending up or they're trending down? Botswana would be trending down. Many other countries would be trending down, like there was Samoa there, who I don't think want to have fertility at 4 because they're islands again. Where will they go? But they are reported to be pretty good at education, whatnot. But we will concentrate on Israel once we also plot, before we plot against freedom. Let's pose the question though. We just saw that the countries that are rated to be full democracies all have currently the fertility rate below the replacement rate. Does democracy equate a behavioral sink? The term behavioral sink is taken from John Calhoun, a person who studied behavior and survival in the groups of mice and rat. And this is, by the way, is not a fertility rate track. This is a population of rats. But if you remember the population of the world growing about linearly by now, not so much exponentially, and the world trends trending down almost uniformly, we will think of, okay, maybe the population will peak and then it will nosedive, and here it says last born here, so that means that their fertility nosedived before the population dropped down and the rats died. Same with mice. Way back, this was done. We could not even blame GMO on the feed that was provided to the mice and rat. They were provided ample food. They were provided a lot of room. They formed, though, overpopulated clusters near the places where they were fed. We see here John Calhoun observing his, lab rats or lab mice. And back then, he was so famous that he met the then Roman Pope to discuss the problem of the behavioral sink. There were some behaviors that he observed in rats and mice that developed as their population increased that then contributed to them dying off. So now that we're all scared, let's look at the plot of fertility versus freedom. Do we see the same thing as fertility versus democracy, given how well they correlated? We do. We see some other countries that were not taken into account by the democracy rating. We see here, however, that these are small island countries like Micronesia, Kiribati, Marshall Islands. We still see Israel prominently enough here. There's some other countries that obscure the graph, like Ghana or Benin, ending up having pretty good freedom scores with high fertility. But if you look at their trends, they're trending down, while Israel is trending up. More human rights aspects exist other than the right for education, especially for secondary education that I mentioned before. And this has to do with the would-be rights to have children and to not have children, neither of which we see in the international documents. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we see the right to marry and to, quote-unquote, found a family, which implies a right to have at least one child, but does not constitute a right to have more than one child, which would be a right to be pushing us above the replacement rate. So that right to found a family is also codified in the European Convention on Human Rights. And there's a paper with more details on that subject that I'm referencing here. There's also an article that entitles Motherhood and Childhood to Special Care, All Children, whether they're born in or out of wedlock. Remember, they said marry and found a family. In and out of wedlock, once the children are born, they shall enjoy the same social protection, but obviously not before. And it does not even explicitly confer a right, per se, to bear children out of wedlock. Or in wedlock, for that matter, not in this article. Then, with the right not to have children, there's a different set of complications. In 2012, we had the first precedent when the UN Population Fund, in its annual report, explicitly described family planning as a human right. Never before. And even so, the report isn't binding. It doesn't have any, it's not a document like the Convention on Human Rights. It doesn't have any legal effects on national laws whatsoever. It does not list abortion among the family planning measures. So there are all sorts of human rights aspects that in the current framework are not resolved at all. More fertility trends. Here we see Israel's so-called demographic miracle. There's an article that's entitled Israel's Demographic Miracle. This is the trend for Israel. They've been going up since 1991 or 2, reasonably consistently. That is unusual. The other countries that I plotted are the top 10 most populous countries. You see Nigeria on top, trending slightly down. We see other countries here, US, meandering a little bit here, going down, up, and now trending down. So that indicates actually, it's difficult to interpret, let's not. So at least it's trending down now, below the replacement rate. Many of them are below the replacement rate. The ones above, we see India. There are other problems in India that we will not try to take on. We will ask, how did they achieve this miracle in Israel? You have a question, please.
When you giving the statistics for Israel, does that include every member of the population, including the
Perfect question. Thank you so much for this question. First of all, here's a list of sources on Israel's demographic miracle, starting with the Dov Friedlander article from 2002. And Friedlander worked on this problem before. There were several articles that he authored before. A very useful article by Evgenia Bystrov from 2012. A recent article from 2016, but it says from 1990 to 2010, so it looks like a secondary source. I really like the other three sources better. Yes, the problem they were working on, as shown in this graph, where they're showing that the Jewish population share was trending down, and it's shown trending down all the way down to 2009, and the share of Muslims increasing because of what you've alluded to with higher fertility among the Israeli Arabs. Speaking of their democracies, there is a party that represents Israeli Arabs. So no wonder they were worried, quoting the late Yasser Arafat, who told them that the womb of the Arab woman is my strongest weapon. And they worked on that. Friedlander indicated that it was unwise to discriminate against Arab women in terms of their right to get education and get jobs, because that forced them to stay home and marry and have babies and offer them no alternative. And yeah, they tried to address that, and that helped them somewhat. But what is more important that they managed to achieve is that they achieved an increase in Jewish births. And most of that increase, because for the ultra-Orthodox part of the population, they were already maxed out at about 7, they achieved a growth from 2.0, 2.2 children per woman in the non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish sector up to 2.6. This is the really interesting thing about the Israeli demographic miracle. Part of the solution was, yes, thank you, that Goldman points out that their exceptional fertility stems from religious commitment rather than ethnicity. There's a data here to support that from the US Jewish population. The second part of the solution was that now with medical advances, more Jewish women decided to give birth at ages in their 40s, and because of the medical treatment peculiarities, more of them had twins and triplets. That could be corrected in the future, but for now we have a contribution from that. They decided to have children late. They used the medical treatment. Instead of one child, they had 2 or 3 children. That's one second part of this. The third part that Evgenia Bystrov identified was that there was an increase of percentage of non-marital childbearing. So a few women, including those in the ages of 40 plus, decided, well, so it's getting late, let's still have a child even if I'm not married. And the conclusions here are that the problem of increasing the fertility rate in the non-ultra-religious population from 2.0 to 2.6 is solvable by example in a free democratic country. The problem, though, has to be addressed explicitly in the society because they really were concerned about what was going on. We have to study more aspects of what the solution really was to see if there were other factors that contributed to the fact that this increased. And the impact of higher education, which is tertiary in the international terminology, ought to be investigated as well. For instance, about 30% of German women with higher education are reported, according to European Union statistics, to be childless, with the figure pretty alarming. So even yesterday on my Twitter feed, I noticed a headline that said literally, Muslim scholar celebrates extinction of blonde, blue-eyed Germans. Now, I mean, fine, this is alarming, and he just follows the footsteps of Yasser Arafat here, but maybe the lessons from Israel could be ported to help out Germans solve their problem. And I would like to emphasize that any extended such solution of this kind would have to be firmly grounded in the human rights framework, so that would take work by the international community to fix their human rights framework. Thank you.
Okay, so we don't even actually have time for questions.
It's okay.
We'll take one if we want.
Thank you very much for your patience.